Very good evening and a warm welcome this evening to the long 19th century. Tonight, this talk is going to take approximately an hour, which is very, very difficult to actually condense such a prolific artist's life into such a short amount of time. But I hope to show you tonight some of the high points, some of the controversies that this great artist faced during his lifetime. It's a very significant period in the history of art, the late part of the 19th century coming into the 20th century. And also, I hope it'll go some way to show that Sargent was an innovative artist and not purely a conventional or just a purely highly skilled artist. He's an artist who is constantly developing and changing throughout his long career. So without further ado, we're just going, I hope you can all see my first slide. These are some of the points that I'm going to be covering this evening, particularly the fact that there's a sort of question really of nationality. He is American, but he was born in Italy, spent much of his career both in France and in Britain, but also, of course, significantly really established himself in the USA as well. So he is a truly international artist, really unlike almost any other of this period. Remember, his contemporary, James McNeill Whistler, never actually went back to the USA once he had embarked upon his career. So for Sargent, really, there is a trajectory which, through force of circumstance, really, when he actually left Paris, that causes him to become even more widely acknowledged throughout the whole world. And he is, of course, a great traveller as well, and someone who picks up on different places, and all these things influence his style. So we're going to be looking about how France, Spain, and Italy all influenced Sargent's unique approach to painting. Of course, as an artist, Sargent is mainly known these days, particularly for his portraits, and the art of portraiture. Artists who practice portraiture know it is a three-way compromise. It's always whether it pleases the artist, the person who commissions the portrait, and also the sitter. And this is a very, very delicate balance, which is not always got right. But Sargent was somebody who was able, miraculously, to keep these three things in a good tension, and it's something which is pretty unique. And of course, that is why he was in such great demand, and why eventually portraiture became irksome to him and almost forced him to change direction in his career. Now, 20th century criticism really just views him as just purely a technical master, that his art is mimetic and superficial. I disagree with that. I believe that he is a marvelous technical painter, but I do not agree with the assessment of people like Roger Fry that his work is superficial. Want to look at the influence of Venice upon his work? The great portraitists of Paris, London, and USA. I want to also look at Sargent's interaction with Impressionism, particularly his friendship with Claude Monet, and also his dalliance with Impressionism, whilst not completely that taking over his career in a way, as he called it, the dab and spot school. But he does have a foot in both camps, and Impressionism does significantly change the way he paints, and certainly the way we think about Sargent in many ways. He is, of course, the great painter of the Belle Epoque, and some of his greatest paintings comes from this period, a conclusion of the 19th century and the Edwardian period. And then we have a very interesting period in Sargent's later life with him going out to the Western Front and painting some very significant paintings, watercolours out there, but also his great paintings, a great painting which we'll examine, which is one of his late great works resulting from World War I. We also think of Sargent, obviously, very often just for these large oil paintings, these big 6-footers and 8-footer paintings, but he is a wonderful watercolorist and probably one of the greatest watercolorists who's ever lived. He shows this great panache of style and versatility, and this has caused him to be I would say, resented by a number of his fellow artists, and particularly by critics in the early 20th century, most notably Roger Fry of the Bloomsbury Group, and the debunking of his career basically by later critics as well. And so his rehabilitation has only really sort of taken foot over the last 30 years, really, but it is a steady progress, and now people are looking at Sargent seriously once again and seeing his work as absolutely vital to our understanding of this transitional period into the modern era. So I'm going to publish this with my PDF, which will be available on the website following the talk. And these give you the significant dates that will help you see how I'm anchoring in some of the paintings I'm showing you tonight. I won't go over these now, but these dates will help you just see what a full career the man had and the significant pivotal points in his life. That, by the way, on the right is a little rondel, a portrait of him as a young man in his 20s. And you can see already that he's a very, very confident painter. But who were the famous artists of the late 19th century? They're certainly not those who we think of today, like Paul Gauguin or even Claude Monet or some of the French Impressionists, and Vincent van Gogh, totally unknown. Those would be the artists people would talk about today if we were looking at late 19th century art. But the era that Sargent comes into, we must remember that by and large, the great artists of that period were artists who were paid extremely well. They often had palatial studios. Here in Britain, we had the great Lord Leighton, who had an enormous studio and house, Leighton House in London, and John Everett Millais with Palace Gate, and many of these artists earning enormous sums, which would be in terms of millions of pounds these days. The artists that surrounded John Singer Sargent as he was embarking on his career, these are just some of the names that are now somewhat eclipsed, of course, and almost forgotten. Some of them, Leon Bonnat, for instance, or Sorolla, Anders Zorn, for instance, or Alphonse Legros, Sophie Anderson, Adolphe Monticelli, and Ribot. All of these artists now are, in a way, some of them are consigned to the basements of museums. They are not thought of as the great artists of the 19th century. And yet Sargent has somewhat transcended many of these artists, whilst retaining something of the academic style that these great these artists of the late 19th century had. So Sargent was born in 1856. He was born in Florence and of American parentage. His father was an eye surgeon. His mother had suffered some sort of mental breakdown, and so his early years were spent he spent in Italy, and was born, as I say, in Florence. The family then moved, and they constantly seem to move around Europe. They don't really play a part in the expatriate community, either in France or in Italy, but tend to go their own way. Although some books say that they were of upper class, they were certainly well off, but not of great means in some ways. But certainly Sargent's father hoped that John Singer Sargent would take up some sort of career, probably in the Navy. However, Sargent, as a young man, showed great facility with his pencil, and he was very much encouraged by his mother to make drawings in some of the great museums of Italy and in France. John Singer Sargent was a very sophisticated man. He could speak fluent German, French, and English, and also passable Spanish as well. So he was a very erudite young man, somewhat of a shy, retiring person. He did have some good friends as a young man. In fact, that portrait there of Fanny Watts was actually a childhood friend of his, and that was his first exhibited painting at the Paris Salon in 1877, when Sargent was 21 years old. He entered the studio of Carolus Duran, who was an artist who was one of these great ateliers in Paris at the time, who was kind of breaking away with a little of the tradition of the École de Beaux-Arts, that artists didn't necessarily have to draw from the cast or and prove themselves in that, but they were allowed to use oil paints for the first time. Now, Carolus Duran encouraged the idea of tonal understanding of light and in painting. And this is very significant. And this portrait that John Singer Sargent paints of his master, Carolus Duran, from 1879, shows a very, very confident young man, 22, 23 years old, painting his master. And it was only 3 or 4 years later that we can say Sargent completely surpassed Duran's work. There's an example of a Carolus Duran portrait painting there of Madame de Lancey at the same period. Of course, the great academic artists of this period were Gérôme and Bouguereau, both of them the great artists of the Salon, among many. And Sargent, really, it was predicted he would follow in that kind of vein, although he did have an eye for, certainly initially it made sense that he would take on portraits, but he certainly had an eye on not a non-sort of classical subject matter, and that was encouraged by Duran to some extent. And so I can show you these paintings here. This particular early painting, Neapolitan Children Bathing, from 1879, is a very good example of Sargent's work at this period. And as you can see, there is an influence of French Impressionism, a great awareness of other artists, particularly like Sorolla, for instance, from Spain. We certainly can see that in his work. We can see a great freedom of brushwork in Sargent's handling of this beach subject, and also, I would say, a certain awareness of Impressionism. But there is obviously a very, very taut draftsmanship within this work, as there is in all of Sargent's work. You notice underlying everything he does is this wonderful draftsmanship and a sense of space. Allied at the same time, if we think of the paintings of Stanhope Forbes from the Newlyn School in Britain, there's similar sort of subjects, the idea of painting working people, and Sargent, you know, when he wasn't doing his portraits and was traveling, was interested in looking at ordinary people. And this painting here, the Fishing for Oysters at Cancale from 1879, a similar date, also exhibited at the Salon, was really an early breakthrough painting. Again, absorbing some of the ideas of Impressionism in terms of light and colour and freedom of handling, but you don't get the sort of dabby or blocky brush strokes that you get in a Claude Monet or even a Manet. There's a tighter handling in Sargent's work at this period, but we can see something akin to painters like George Clawson in Britain, and also the great influence of Bastien Lafage, who was an enormous influence on all artists at this period in his paintings of rural life, which are an amalgam of Impressionism and photography. And also, I would say, his portraits. There's a portrait in the top right-hand corner here, which gives you an example of how Lafage probably would have influenced some of Sargent's work during this period. But perhaps the greatest influence upon Sargent's early work is the art of Spain. And we can see that in a number of his paintings of the late 1870s and early 1880s. And Sargent indeed made a trip to the Prado expressly in the late 1870s to copy the paintings of Diego Velázquez. Now, Velázquez and Goya were both heroes of the great Edouard Manet, and Manet too had been very much influenced by the art of Spain, as we know. And of course, Manet's work was really known to Sargent, and Sargent was actually involved after Manet's death in the purchase of his the great painting Olympia by Edouard Manet. So this is something that occurs really early on in Sargent's career, this connection with the bravura of Spanish painting. And I would recommend this particular book by Trevor Fairbrother, Sargent, Song Singer Sargent, The Sensualist, because to understand Sargent, you've got to understand that his paintings are a development of aestheticism as well, that they are about a feast for our senses. And this occurs in a number of different ways within his work. And in that, he is quite innovative. So bear that in the back of your mind when you're looking at his paintings, even though he is influenced by the great artists who I've listed at the bottom of the page here: Veronese, Tintoretto, Rubens, Frans Hals, and above all, Velázquez. He is an artist who's also influenced by the new aestheticism that is taking place in late 19th century art. That example there, Stringing Onions, would be a good one to show you. And he painted many such works, also in North Africa as well. But these are the paintings that he copied in the Prado. You can see some of that still in the Velázquez room in the Prado. Velázquez had an absolutely enormous influence upon the young John Singer Sargent, partly because Velázquez is known as the painter's painter, that his freedom of brushwork and yet his precision was quite extraordinary. And it's something that appealed to the young John Singer Sargent. And you can see Sargent makes some very passable copies of some of the Velázquez paintings of the royal court of Charles V. But he wasn't. Velázquez, of course, had an enormous influence, particularly in Britain, on artists such as James McNeill Whistler, and Millet's diploma work was a souvenir of Velázquez, painted in 1868. So Velázquez was exerting this enormous power upon European art at this time. And one can see why, because his works also show a really modern and exciting handling of colour and paint. And so really we can say that if we were looking for influences upon Sargent in his early life, we're not looking to Dutch painting particularly, apart from Frans Hals. We are definitely looking to the art of Spain. And we can certainly see this in this painting that is now at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a wonderful museum in Boston, which I'll be talking about a bit later. There's a photograph of the painting in situ, actually among Andalusian wall tiles, so it's all very, very lovely connection. And Sargent became quite obsessed with the life of Spain in many ways. And so this early painting here that I'm showing in the top left hand shows the Flamenco Dancer. Very unconventional in a way it's actually set up in its spatial relationships. One can sense the sounds also within it. I don't think it's too much to say that you can actually hear the click of the castanets and the strum of the guitars in the background. So wonderfully does Sargent paint this, and look at the shadows too. They are exciting, and every space within a Sargent painting is used. And it's a terrific work, and I highly recommend it. If you manage to get to Boston, this early painting by Sargent would be one that would really be one to see. This sketch from Capri also gives you a great example of the sort of things Sargent was painting on his summer travels. Now, every summer, Sargent went to different countries. Later parts of his career, he spent a long periods of time in Switzerland, but of course he would travel at all times, and at North Africa. But this early influence of Spain was a profound one. But too, there was something else going on that he noticed in French art at the time, and he did have an eye out for the great things that were happening in what we would consider modern French painting, and particularly the work of Claude Monet. We can remember Claude Monet had painted this painting in 1872, Impression Sunrise, which was part of this earlier exhibition at Nadars Gallery in Paris. And the Impressionism really absorbed most of the 1870s. And whether you were an academic artist or a young artist, you would be looking at the Impressionists, and they had a profound influence upon the young John Singer Sargent. Sargent painted some really quite moving seascapes as a traveller, and this particular one here, Atlantic Storm, was shown in Britain in recent years, and I think it's a terrific painting from 1876. So we're talking a 20-year-old painting something like this, a really, really dramatic piece of work. Could almost be like a Winslow Homer painting, as you know, American art, and yet this is painted 20 years before Winslow Homer became the great painting of the sea and the great American artist. But it was during this period that you get the great paintings of waves by Gustave Courbet, the great French realist. So Sargent is absorbing all these influences. And Diego Velázquez plays an enormous part in his this early painting, The Daughters of Edward Darley Boit from 1882, really seen as a very, very important painting and something that was very, very unconventional at the time, particularly in composition. You can notice, as the directors there of the Prado Museum standing by it, the painting was influenced by Las Meninas, by Diego Velázquez, The Maids, one of the greatest paintings ever painted, really, in the Prado in Madrid. And you can, this painting is all about illusion, about space and reflection, and Sargent mirrors that in his own way, in modern terms, painting the daughters, and it's an odd arrangement of people. Notice also the great porcelain pots in the background, something that appears in many of James McNeill Whistler's paintings. But the spatial divisions are unusual, and it was criticised at the time as it was thought highly unconventional. But it did show Sargent as a very innovative artist, and we mustn't forget this when we're looking at his, particularly at his career. We mustn't just think he was just painting the great and the good. At this stage, he really was breaking new ground in portraiture. No more so than his wonderful 3 portraits of Robert Louis Stevenson, whom he got on with very, very well. This portrait of Robert Louis Stevenson, his wife, printed in 1885, is a great example because it's almost sort of cartoon-like in a way, the gangly figure of Robert Louis Stevenson pacing the floor of his room, his wife almost in the corner. All of these things very unconventional. They're almost Whistlerian in the way that the placement of people. And yet they are very, very powerful and moving portraits. And Sargent did like to paint people that he knew. And we've recently had an exhibition in the last 10 years at National Portrait Gallery of Sargent's friends and associates. And he excelled in painting people that he knew well. And he is enabled to imbue them with great sense of character with just a few dabs and brushstrokes. This is the great skill of John Singer Sargent, that is what he learned from Carolus Duran. The tonal values are absolutely exquisite and absolutely right, and so he can suggest with one brushstroke what many a lesser artist might spend weeks painting with tinier brushes, but Sargent is able to do it with a quick sweep of the brush, and is able to suggest materials and surfaces in a wonderful sort of way. Just look at the dresser behind the wicker chair in this portrait in the right hand corner there. He did do 3 portraits of Robert Louis Stevenson, and they're really well worth seeing if you can. But of course, at this stage, I think I ought to bring up the whole this whole critical aspect towards Sargent that it still exists very much in art criticism and in among art critics today, particularly in the 20th century. Sargent's name was really trashed by Roger Fry, whom there was a great deal of personal animosity between Sargent and Fry, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But also in the 20th century through the critic John Berger as well, because of course Sargent, like Velázquez, many of his greatest subjects were the well-known, the well-to-do, the upper classes, and of course the whole spirit of modern art was really anarchic and was to break away from those certainly to paint portraits of nobility or royalty. And of course, that is why paintings like Anna Gattoni's portrait of Queen Elizabeth II are similarly sort of debunked. But I think it's unfair in many ways, in technical terms, with someone like Sargent, because his paintings are rather like Goya's paintings of the Bourbon family. That they have a deep insight into people, and they are not purely superficial paintings. And in their greatest cases, I think in terms of skill, they do rival even Velasquez in some cases. And he certainly shouldn't be just ranked in with other Edwardian and Victorian portraitists who are of lesser skill. And we must also remember the enormous amount of production that Sargent went through. He was such a hard-working artist, an enormously hard-working man. Not for him, even when he was on vacation, he was working all the time, painting watercolors. And so we have a really huge body of work. So the first enormous controversy, as he set up in Paris, and really he's in his late 20s now, but this Madame Gertrude from Louisiana was the talk of Paris in the early 1880s. She was really a great celebrity and fascinated many artists, and the soirees of Paris were all agog talking about her. So she was very well known, and Sargent was not commissioned to paint her, but sought to paint her because she had exquisite lines, as he put it, that her profile was absolutely unique. He painted her a number of times, but this particular painting, Madame X, which was exhibited at the Paris Salon, caused an enormous scandal, and it brought Sargent's Parisian career to a screeching halt. You would think this would be strange being in Paris because the salon was chock full of nudes and studies of human flesh. And yet this painting was considered indecorous and scandalous. Now, I have a photograph here in the middle of why it was considered so, because as you can see, the shoulder strap from Madame Gertrude's long black gown had fallen over her shoulder. And so it incensed both Madame Gertrude and her mother and many of Paris society. And he lost a great deal of commissions as a result of it, and in a way it was really the end for the time being of his career as the up-and-coming artist on the Parisian scene. He later corrected Madame X's portrait, and you can see that in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. It is a very fine painting, and look at the skill and a twist in her right arm, just and the absolute brilliance, the way he gets her holding her fan and the profile. It is a brilliant piece of painting. Perhaps we can't even understand why today this would be seen as so scandalous, but it certainly was at the time. There's Sargent in his studio. So it left him in a great dilemma. And in fact, he had to virtually sell up, and with his friend, Henry James, suggested that he would come over to London and set up studio in London. Now, this was a bold move, because if anything, London was even more hidebound than Paris in many ways. At least there were a number of very avant-garde artists in London, in Paris, and the ones in London were certainly far more bohemian than Sargent would ever be, particularly Rossetti and Whistler. And certainly Sargent already had developed quite a painterly, a precise style that wasn't in accord with, say, some of the pre-Raphaelite artists in London. So, but he did make an entry onto the scene in London in 1886, and with the help of Henry James, a number of very good connections. Also, Frederick Leighton was kept a weather eye out for new artists coming on the scene, and he was quite appreciative of John Singer Sargent, although Sargent showed no inclination to adopt at this stage anything like the classicism that Leighton worked with, or indeed the high subject matter that was required for some of the larger pieces at the Royal Academy each summer exhibition. So Sargent, although exhibiting at the Royal Academy, preferred the Grosvenor Gallery under Commons car, and who was the new director of it, and he painted them. And the Grosvenor Gallery, of course, was the great gallery where the falling rocket scandal of Whistler had taken place, but it was an excellent place to show some of Sargent's more adventurous new work. And so, but in Britain, Sargent was considered far too French for many British artists and their taste. And a number of the artists depicted in Charles West Cope's R.A. Hanging Committee, which we can see there, certainly viewed some of Sargent's work with great suspicion, thinking it wasn't fully finished and it was far too impressionistic. But Sargent certainly establishes something of a practice within London in the mid 1880s, and we have the beginnings of his studio, which later expanded, and he moves to the same area that Whistler had frequented, Tite Street, and under the architect Sir Robert William Edis, we have the studio, which exists today. It's still in the family. It isn't. I don't think you can actually visit it, but various art historians have, obviously, like Andrew Graham Dixon. But I have some photographs from Chelsea Library here, which gives you some ideas of the interior of Sargent's studio. And I believe one of these studios is almost untouched since his death. So it has an enormous northern light, which is desired by all portrait painters, the dais and the easels, and various pieces of classical sculpture around. So it's now in the hands of the Ormond family, and we'll meet the Ormond family a little bit later, and they are the great keepers of much of Sargent's work and his legacy, and certainly some of the books written by the Ormonds are worth consulting if you want to know anything about John Singer Sargent and the backstory. So really, at Tite Street, there began a procession of society, and in a way, it was very fortunate, because almost Sargent became the new George Romney or Thomas Gainsborough. It was seen, the fashions of the time lent themselves very much to Sargent's painterly handling. And indeed, you can see a great mirroring in some of Sargent's portraits of the greats of British 18th century painting, Thomas Gainsborough, Reynolds, and George Romney particularly. And so much so, if you look at that painting of Viscountess Astor slightly later, but if you look at that and the painting of Lady Hamilton, you can see that the poses are deliberately mimicking the great tradition of British painting. And that's a lovely little cartoon up there of some of the, a little bit later on in the very early 20th century of a queue forming outside Sargent's studio at Tite Street. But it ever became a burden to him, painting more and more of such paintings. But these group portraits were, for what he is, very, very well known. They're enormous paintings, and those of you who have seen them will know just what I mean, that they are 8-footers and the figures are life-size. His first painting of an unconventional group of young women, the Mrs. Vickers, was labelled the worst picture in the Royal Academy of 1886. I don't think that is at all fair, but it didn't do him any harm eventually, because this unconventional posing of figures became his hallmark, really. And as we can see, there's a good antecedents with this, particularly Joshua Reynolds' The Ladies' Waldegrave from National Gallery of Scotland, and Millet's pastiche of that in Hearts Are Trumps, and Thomas Gainborough's The Linley Sisters. Sargent worked within this tradition, but revised it in the light of his studies of Diego Velázquez and his wonderful handling of space and colour and light. And so a painting like the Mrs. Vickers is now seen as a real masterpiece. I like the painting of the Wyndham sisters less, but some of these paintings are still significant great paintings, and they are unconventional in the way the figures are arranged throughout the canvas. A really successful painting from 1892 in the National Gallery of Scotland is Lady Agnew. And again, as you can see, it's a real development in painterly technique from someone like Millet's bold portrait of Charles Dickens' daughter, Kate Berrettini, from 1880. It's a real development of that, and that is a fine portrait by Millet. But look how Sargent has even greater breadth of touch, and yet how wonderfully balanced the gaze of Lady Agnew is towards us, and how sophisticated. It was recognised by 1890 that Sargent had really become master of his trade, and he was a painter almost like no other. By 1892, he was beginning to make his name in the USA as well, and particularly in Boston. If you look at a painter like Tissot, who was also working in London during this period, you can see whilst Tissot's shows up the fashions of the period, there's a much tighter handling, and really we can't enjoy the brushwork that we can in the Sargent's work. And Sargent is this master of brushwork, and he can make things like fabrics appear luscious and real, and yet still full of just that you can see that they're just a matter of a few brush marks, and there is real skill in that. There is this deft touch is something that is unique to Sargent, and makes him the leading painter really of this type of thing within the whole of Europe. And these are just some of the fine paintings for which he is really known, and many people would know him. And there's many a stately home in Britain and which possess Sargent's paintings. And of course, he's paying homage to the greats like Thomas Gainsborough in these paintings. Very often, he is also looking to Van Dyck as well, because some of these paintings being hung high upon the wall, he has to almost elongate the figures so that you get strange distortions and foreshortenings. So they can look odd if they are hung at certain levels within galleries. But this is all because very often they had to be arranged for large salons and rooms, and so sometimes they can appear awkward if hung in the wrong way. So an arm can appear very long, or you know, there should only be 9 heads actually fit into the length of the human body, whereas of course, like in a Burne-Jones, you might have more. So there is all of that going on in Sargent's work. Particularly the portrait of Lady Spare, very much like the Gainsborough one of his own daughter. But at the same time, Sargent also had an eye upon Impressionism, and he had developed a good friendship with the great French Impressionist Claude Monet, and spent time with Monet in Giverny, and Monet also met Sargent in London as well. Sargent is also very well aware of James McNeill Whistler's work. So here's a painting, Fishing Boats at Whitby, 1884, and I think you can see quite a definite Whistlerian influence upon that one, if not an influence of Turner as well. But you could also see something of Claude Monet in it. And possibly, so Sargent is really, you know, for his downtimes, he would be spending time painting landscapes, because painting all these portraits was taking a toll upon him. And so with a group of other artists, he liked to spend time away, and particularly 2 places become very important to him. He stayed at a place called Calcott, which is just on the outskirts of Reading by the River Thames, and he paints a number of Impressionist paintings there with his friend Dennis Bunker, a fellow American artist. He paints very freely when he is sort of on vacation in a way. And his paintings could even be looked at as, you know, they are akin to a Claude Monet's in many respects. Although Sargent is always quite able to use darker tones than Monet. Unlike Monet, he didn't abandon the use of black or Payne's grey within his paintings. But you can certainly see the influence of Manet in some of Sargent's paintings of this period. He also was a part, and he continually was a part of this group which met in the Cotswolds near to here, the Broadway group. And anybody who knows the Cotswolds know Broadway is a fine little town with the tower on the hill. Here it was that John Singer Sargent spent a number of summers painting and would return there, and he painted these extraordinary paintings, which are absolutely pieces of Impressionism. Particularly the old chair, 1884. So we're looking there at 4 years before Van Gogh painted his own chair. It's interesting to see these things, and also these ones of boats and of women with parasols, mimicking Claude Monet's work. And of course, at Giverny, John Singer Sargent also paints his friend Claude Monet painting at Giverny. And so there is this really great backwards and forwards between the two artists. And particularly in the late 1880s, this is a very, very fruitful period and an interesting period in Sargent's work. And this one of Monet painting is also instructive because it tells us a lot about the way Monet painted and the circumstances of that, but it also shows that John Singer Sargent was fully aware of what Monet was doing and his understanding of translating shadows into pure colour and tone. And Sargent does something of the same and continues this tradition throughout his later career, so that later portrait group with parasols painted in Switzerland, later on in his career, he is still referencing French Impressionism. And that's Sargent's portrait of Claude Monet from 1887. At this time, Sargent also met the great sculptor Auguste Rodin, a friend also of Monet, and Sargent too painted a number of sea pieces as well. And we remember that Claude Monet was yet at this point to tackle seriously large seascapes, and I'm sure the two discussed things like that. Also, Rodin was obviously his drawings from the human figure also interested Sargent, who continued to draw from life throughout his whole career. And this was to form the basis for much of his later career when Sargent turns to become a muralist. His study of the human anatomy and the human figure is akin to that of Auguste Rodin. This painting is one that was painted at Broadway, and one of his most famous paintings, Lily, Lily, Rose. It is the lines from a song. The Wreath is the name of a song, a popular song of the period. It was painted during twilight, and it is a wonderful painting which is fascinating so many artists on so many levels. It is wonderfully decorative, and yet it is an accurate transcription of these Chinese lanterns at twilight. Sargent apparently put down his tennis racket in the evening, and he knew it was exactly the right hour, and he worked consistently for 2 months, but only for a few minutes each evening to get the light correct in the background of this painting. It's often been mentioned that the actual configuration of this painting mirrors a William Morris the Golden Lily design, and I certainly can see a correspondence between the two. It's also something that continually fascinates artists, this idea of light within the painting, not just the examination of light source as in a Claude Monet, but it's almost that the light source comes from within the painting itself, and you get that in paintings way back from Caravaggio, and particularly Georges de la Tour in his painting of St. Joseph the Carpenter, which Sargent cites and notes. And so we get something of that in Sargent's fantastic work here. And this one in Tate Britain is considered one of the high points of his Impressionist period, and it was exhibited at the Royal Academy. And some criticism, but also to a great deal of admiration too. And it had an enormous effect on a number of younger artists as well. At this time, Sargent, this great period of the 1890s, he meets the great London-born picture dealer and entrepreneurial family, the Wertheimers. Now, the Wertheimers were a very, very important family, both sides of the Atlantic, actually, and a very, very important business people. That's their house at 8 Connaught Place, and it was affectionately known as Sargent's Mess, particularly because there were no less than 12 portraits commissioned by Asher Wertheimer of his family, of his children, and as they grew. And so Sargent's portraits of the Wertheimers are among some of the greatest of his portrait paintings. There's Wertheimer, Asher Wertheimer, with his cigar and his trusty black poodle Noble in the corner. You might not notice that at first, but it's in the bottom left-hand corner, the panting dog. This painting is now in Tate Britain. I'm afraid they don't show the painting that much. It might look just rather murky and black, but it isn't. It's a tremendous bit of painting. It also shows this great picture dealer who had such an eye for the modern, and also introducing Sargent to so many of his great clients. So the Wertheimers play a big part in Sargent's life, and indeed the daughters and sons and daughters of Asher Wertheimer are an important part of his body of work. It's often been mentioned the influence of photography upon Sargent. Sargent did have photographs made of his paintings. He never painted directly from photographs, but we can see, particularly in something like this, this is orchestral painting, that he would have been influenced certainly by cut-off points in photography and the framing of photography. He wasn't influenced as much as, say, a fellow American artist like Thomas Eakins or William Merritt Chase. But in a similar way to Edgar Degas was, Sargent was very well aware of photography and what that lent to a new understanding of space within painting. And so there's studies yet to be written really on how photography influenced John Singer Sargent's work. But I would say all of his portraits were painted direct from life. He would stand the painting on the dais by the sitter, and he would pace backwards and forwards. And apparently he wore out several carpets as he walked backwards and forwards to get the exact skin tones right from his sitters. And so photography did not play the part that it did in Eakins' portraiture. My last slide tonight will show you one of Sargent's flesh tone palettes, which is held by the Royal Academy, which shows you how he measured flesh tones. And of course, he also, rather like Madame X, he made a beeline for the great actress Ellen Terry. And this is his wonderful painting of Ellen Terry as Lady Macbeth, and who had previously, of course, been painted in this painting. We'll talk about this one by G.F. Watts, following the disastrous marriage between Watts and Ellen Terry at an earlier period. But there she is as a mature woman, Ellen Terry, appearing at the Lyceum. And a wonderful painting here. And again, it also emphasized Sargent's skill in painting costume. And in Sargent's studio, he had a wonderful wardrobe of costumes and fabrics. He delighted in recording exotic silks and satins. All of those things become parts of his paintings, and no more so than this remarkable painting of Ellen Terry at the height of her powers. But his fortuitous meeting with Isabella Stewart Gardner, who was a remarkable woman, and the exhibit and her gallery, which is in Boston, is an absolute go-to place if you are traveling in North America. It is a wonderful collection of work. Stewart Gardner was really a great figure, and she was a strong supporter of Sargent's work, and Sargent painted this remarkable portrait of her, which her husband absolutely detested, this particular painting, and it wasn't actually publicly shown until later on, but it's part of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. There's another painting there by Sargent's contemporary Anders Zorn, the Scandinavian artist. Again, quite an interesting painting. She was a very unconventional woman, and was certainly light up the room of any of these great parties in New England at the time. You know, you get the sense that she's just full of life. And Sargent continued a friendship with her right to the end of her life, and he painted some very moving watercolors of her in the last years of her life as well. And they are remarkable pieces of painting. But she was the one who got him some of the best commissions, and particularly in Boston, and the Boston Murals, which were to absorb the last 30 years of his career, are really down to her influence and to pulling the right strings. And Sargent was always had these very good people networking for him throughout, particularly back in he had Henry James and a number of other people who spoke well of him and worked well with him. Now, this is actually, I've got a photograph here of Mrs. Warren and her daughter Rachel being painted actually within the gardener's property here. You can see that in a photograph, and that's the example of how Sargent painted. You see the painting is right next to the dais. And so he's really translating the colours that he sees directly from his sitters. Again, an unconventional pose. If you look at this painting, I love this painting, but it is very unconventional in many ways, having the daughter's head sort of on the shoulder, rather like you might get a dog leaning on the shoulder. It is unconventional, but totally convincing and very, very exciting. And Sargent also had quite a say in what people wore as well. He sometimes told people to go back home and get another dress or another something else. So he had ideas about how different satins would play off against one another, and the type of furniture that he wanted in some of his paintings. Of course, in Isabella Stewart Gardner's home, there were many fine bits of furniture that could be used, and wonderful props there. He was also this great life painter, and again, this sensual quality to Sargent's work. And we should not forget that he was wonderful studies from anatomy, and very sensual are his paintings too. Those give you some examples of his life studies. Look at Sargent's Egyptian Girl. This painting is in the Art Institute in Chicago, a remarkable piece of painting really from life, and very, very bold. And I mean, you know, if Madame X was considered indecorous, this particular painting would also be considered such. And but it is similar to maybe some of Sorola's work at the period. But the nude study here of Thomas McKellar, who was a favourite model of his, actually he models for some of the figures in the Boston Murals as well. And it's a wonderful life study of Thomas E. McKellar. And Sargent did have some particular favourite models whom he worked from. And he was always, unlike many artists who in their later careers gave up working with charcoal, this was not the case with Sargent. He continued to use sketchbooks throughout his life and continued to work in charcoal and sanguine on paper. But it wasn't without difficulty. As on the dawn of the 20th century, we have the new generation coming in, and particularly of the school known as Post-Impressionism. And we get a position where there is almost two camps, particularly within Britain, between the traditionalists and the moderns. And of course, Henry Tonks, upholding the great academic values in the Slade School in London, akin to Sargent. Tonks had been a surgeon and was a great exponent of life drawing and an anatomical study. But so there was this great tension between the new art coming out from France in particularly, and Fry had in his in an article, he provided a list in this thing in a New York weekly called The Nation. He said of artists who supported Post-Impressionism, and he mentioned Sargent. And Sargent was incandescent with fury when he thought that he would be supporting artists like Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin. And so he then really, at this point, these two men locked horns, and this continued. And even after Sargent's death, Fry was debunking Sargent. And so Fry, part of the Bloomsbury group, obviously was the great champion of late 19th century French Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, but he saw nothing later of value in Sargent's work. Part of the reason for the animosity was that Roger Fry had held a watercolour exhibition in the same gallery that Sargent also showed watercolours, and Sargent's watercolours had sold and Fry's hadn't. So there was a lot of personal history, shall we say, between this pair. But the whole thing for Sargent by the early years of the Edwardian era was beginning to wear upon him. He said he was beginning to hate painting portraits, and he really was wanting to break away from it. And so it was very, very difficult, because he could have maintained these sort of commissions right to the end of his life. But he was becoming weary of the whole thing, of having to paint you know, nobility, both sides of the Atlantic, and people who, industrialists, and everybody's daughter who was debutantes. It was becoming extremely irksome to him. Whilst one can't exactly say that there was a decline in quality, one senses a weariness coming into his work, and a sense that he needs a break. He is the great painter of the fashions of the Belle Epoque and Edwardian Britain, and much has been made of how Sargent, if you were painted by Sargent in the latest fashions, it really is almost like it's a fashion catalogue, his work in the early 1900s. And they're wonderful paintings. I mean, who can paint velvet like Sargent, or satin like Sargent? That certainly is true, and he never lost his touch with that. But he becomes disenchanted with that. And so he comes to some sort of compromise. He still takes on commissions, but he will only occasionally take a painted commission. Rather, he prefers to do some of these faster and more rapid charcoal drawings, which are wonderful in themselves. They are wonderful drawings, no doubt about it. They are very, very highly skilled drawings. We would expect no less from Sargent. But he takes on less of these very, very large portrait commissions, and spends more time in Switzerland with his nieces, painting them, and he becomes increasingly interested in watercolour and the possibilities that watercolour painting provides, and particularly in Venice. And Venice is always, within many artists, seen as a place of renewal. It was for Turner, it was for James McNeill Whistler, for Claude Monet, and now it is for John Singer Sargent. He had been familiar with Venice for many years, but his paintings of the early 1900s were certainly some of his most wonderful works, and they are in watercolour. And that I must recommend Richard Ormond's book, the 1898 to 1913 Venetian and Figures and Landscapes. Wonderful book, and it has so many of these terrific watercolours where, with only a few touches, he sums up the light of the Venetian canals in a way really unlike any other artist. Even Turner had not quite got that shimmering effect of light that Sargent achieves. He's working at the same time in Venice. He actually he sits in a gondola as he paints these things, and of course they're small scale. They're not like the Claude Monet canvases of Venice, but they are wonderful paintings, and I heartily recommend that particular book. And he travels a lot. Look at that one he paints on his holidays. This one he calls On Holidays, 1901, of fishing in Norway. He also is very, very fond of his niece, Rosemary Ormond, who models in so many of these paintings. The two on the right here are of his favourite niece, who was in Paris, but she travelled with him often to Switzerland, and she is the subject of many, many of his paintings of this period. I should mention also Vernon Lee, Violet Paget, of course, who is known as Vernon Lee. That's a pen name, and she is a childhood friend of Sargent, and she writes very, very well as Sargent. And one thing about Sargent, although never married, he was a very, very loyal friend, but he was something of a retiring and shy man, who, although he could be put at ease, he did find that there were these loyal friendships, particularly with people like Henry James and Violet Paget and his nieces. These were very important to him, and his sister as well. And this is the portrait of Henry James, and this was painted for James's 70th birthday, and it was exhibited at the Royal Academy. But it was, of course, one of these famous paintings in 1914, which was attacked with a hatchet, including, so the Rokeby Venus by Velasquez was attacked by a suffragette with a hatchet, as was the painting of Thomas Carlyle by John Everett Millais, and so was his portrait of Henry James at the Royal Academy. So, but the painting has been fully repaired now, and it's back to its full power. But that's an example of his portrait of his great friend Henry James. And these are examples. Now, his niece Rosemary Ormond, who I mentioned, who he went on holiday with most summers to Switzerland. She was a very caring person, and she became a nurse in Paris, and to many of those who were blinded by mustard gas in the Great Western Front and in the First World War. And she can be seen in this little cartoon as the third nurse in the middle of the picture here. Well, tragically, Rosemary was killed in Paris by an explosion from one of the guns of a bomb that fell upon. She was listening to a concert in Paris, and this was a tragic moment in Sargent's life, and in fact brought something about within Sargent's life which really was quite unpredicted. I mean, he was entering his 60s, and yet he then becomes a war artist, and in fact joins Henry Tonks out on the Western Front. Henry Tonks, particularly interested in painting some of the injuries of the war wounded, quite a grim selection of paintings, but very, very moving in many ways. He was a surgeon as well, the great Slade professor. But Sargent then takes his watercolors to the Western Front, and he paints the soldiers and things like wrecked sugar refineries and buildings around Arras, goes out to the front, and he paints some harrowing paintings that are totally unlike anything else in his career. And this painting here, the Western Front, which can be considered the masterpiece of his late career, Gassed, which is now in the Imperial War Museum, is in fact this high point, this great masterpiece of Sargent's life, really. And it's a painting of these gassed soldiers walking in mimicking a Roman triumph, but of course all of the men here have been blinded by mustard gas, and it is a tragic painting. Even more so because behind it, if you look through the gaps, you can see other more uninjured young men playing football in the background, which adds to the pathos of the painting. The painting is something based on Tintoretto's The Raising of the Cross. Sargent was fully aware of what he was doing with that, in saying that. You can see the ropes in the background holding the barrage balloon look like the ropes, the raising of the cross. So he's alluding to the crucifixion within his painting. He's alluding to the Arch of Titus in Rome, and he's also alluding to Pieter Bruegel's, the Elder's painting, the parable of the blind leading the blind, falling into a ditch. So he's making a comment about the First World War and its carnage. And it's a terrific painting and a real high point of his career. Not so this painting. When he was commissioned, of course, still as a war commissions, he paints the great Field Marshal Douglas Haig, who's often blamed for so much of the carnage of the Western Front, and he paints all the generals and officers of World War I. This one's in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and you can look at that there, but I don't think the fine. It's just a sea of khaki, really. Nothing like the painting Gassed. But there's another one, Street in Arras, a wonderful painting, and again the graveyard in Tyrol is almost prescient of the opening of the Second World War. And I would point out at this time that there were other artists now who were beginning to take up the mantle the Sargent had sort of left. There was obviously the great paintings of Augustus John were becoming very, very popular during this period, and William Orpen as well within London, and the New English Art Club continued much in a tradition of some of Sargent's more informal paintings. So Sargent was engaged throughout this whole period, and this is the really ending of his career, are these great Boston murals, initially started 30 years before, and they are in the Boston Library and in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and they are terrific things. I'm sorry that some of my photographs here were not as good. I didn't have as good camera for these, but some are good, and some of the studies for them are good. And they are particularly interesting because they show another departure in his art. Some of the Boston murals obviously are of classical subjects, and the other ones, looking at religion, became quite controversial. No more so than this particular painting, which shows the synagogue as it's known, and this brought great criticism, and almost as much criticism as the Madame X had so many years before, because it depicts Judaism in a point of collapse, which of course was highly offensive to so many of his major benefactors, and of course not least within Boston, because at this time there was a great resurgence of particularly of Reform Judaism within Boston. That is the Temple Israel within Boston, and they even built a bigger one. That one was right up to 1926, and you can still see that building in Boston. But it depicted synagogue as blind, and mimicking those figures from his painting Gast as well. You can see some of the actual drawings for that are sort of, you could almost see one to the other. So the painting so incensed a number of people that it was actually splashed with a phial of ink in 1924. And Sargent never actually never completed this series, which looked at the prophets and the patriarchs from the Bible through to the New Testament. Sargent was following something of a tradition which was possibly uncomfortable to him too, because he was following almost in a sort of a G.F. Watts type style, and Sargent was never fully comfortable, perhaps, in suggesting deeper themes within art, or certainly classical or religious themes. I think he's much more skilled when it was something like the painting Gast than this. But the series of murals are, in fact, very powerful. And in spite of the controversial aspect of this particular one, they should be seen and viewed. If you go to Boston, I do highly recommend them, because they are a very different pinnacle to his career, and take an unusual twist right at the end as he approaches 70 years of age. And a number of the sketches for them are actually in the Royal Academy and can be seen today. So that was a late latter day sort of controversy within his work, but it's worth pointing out that that it certainly didn't add to his later part of the 20th century being thought of as a great artist who everyone should go to. In fact, when you consider there are artists like Gustav Klimt painting great murals at this time, you think of Sargent's, and you think people don't think of them in quite the same bracket as they would maybe with a Gustav Klimt from a little bit earlier. And yet they are highly skilled, and Sargent's skill in depicting the human figure is incomparable. So he comes back to London, and Sargent dies at the age of 69 in 1925, and if you're interested, you can find his grave in a cemetery, Brookwood Cemetery in Wokingham, and that is the marker. Also, he's buried with his sister, and I just included here his palette, his flesh-tone palette, which I think is quite interesting. This is preserved by the Royal Academy, and I hope tonight I've given you something of a whistle-stop tour through Sargent's illustrious career, its controversies, its high points and its low points, and those who would detract from him today. But I think there are few artists who can really draw and paint quite like Sargent. But the bitterness continued. Fry continued to lambast Sargent, and even when there was a a show put on of Sargent's work following his death. This was rapidly debunked by Fry, who even accused Sargent of not being a real artist at all. Sargent, of course, the great Fry, of course, the great exponent of modernism, particularly Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso. And in a way, their art had fallen into two very distinct camps by the 1940s. We get Alfred Munnings, who was far more of the Sargent camp, doing his famous valedictory speech in which he drunkenly lambasts Pablo Picasso, but that's for another day. We can do that, the story of that on another one of my talks. So we come to the end, and I'm happy to take questions there. There's another one of the late Sargent. That's one of his very, very late works for the Boston series. And those are a few book recommendations. I have a number more, which I'll give you in the bibliography that we'll be publishing soon. I do highly recommend the Ormond family series on John Singer Sargent, and they are the sort of keepers of his work today. And that series are beautifully illustrated, and well, if you've got the money for it, I really do suggest you buy some of those, because they are terrific books just to look at, and the scholarly insight into each work is really worth looking at.